The roar of engines tore through the stillness of the Norfolk countryside just as dawn began to break. Across golden barley fields stretching to the horizon, a place once filled only with birdsong and the soft whisper of wind was now overwhelmed by the harsh metallic noise of excavators and heavy trucks. Layers of earth were being dug up without pause. Dust filled the air. Local residents stood at a distance in shock, their eyes full of confusion. An elderly man murmured in worry. This was not an ordinary construction site. This was something far bigger. Something was being hidden. None of them could have imagined that the center of this chaos would lead directly to one of the most private and discreet royal residences, Anmer Hall, once seen as a symbol of peace and absolute privacy. A special gift from Queen Elizabeth II to Princess Anne was now being pulled into an unprecedented storm of controversy. Allegations began to spread like wildfire. Camilla and her son, Tom Parker Bowles, were suspected of quietly transforming the property into an unauthorized luxury resort, completely disregarding Anne's legal authority over it. What shocked the public even more was the mysterious flow of money. In just a few short months, more than £2.5 million were believed to have been transferred through offshore funds, leaving behind countless unanswered questions. Was this merely a management oversight, or a carefully calculated plan to seize control of assets and power from within the royal family? So, what do you think? Is this just a misunderstanding, or a sophisticated scheme? Comment number 1 if you believe it is a misunderstanding. Number 2, if you think this was intentional. And now, we will begin to uncover the full truth behind this story. Anmer Hall has long been considered one of the last remaining private corners within a royal family constantly under scrutiny. Nestled in the Norfolk countryside, surrounded by ancient trees and endless fields, it carries a sense of peace that feels almost completely detached from the outside world. Mornings here usually begin gently. Sunlight filters through the leaves. A thin layer of mist lingers on the grass, and the only sounds to be heard are birds singing or the wind brushing against old stone walls. But that peace was suddenly and violently shattered at around 6 in the morning, when most residents in the area were still asleep. A series of unfamiliar sounds began to emerge. At first, it was only distant engine noise, but within minutes, it quickly turned into a storm of sound. Trucks roared, metal clashed, excavators dug relentlessly. The ground trembled slightly, as if from a minor shock. Families living near Anmer Hall began opening their doors in confusion. No one understood what was happening. Within that single morning, more than 50 heavy vehicles had appeared. Trucks carrying materials moved in and out continuously. Excavators operated without rest. Areas that had once been strictly protected were suddenly breached, as if a large-scale construction project had been planned in advance. Yet what stood out was that no one in the local community had been informed. No warning signs, no permits made public. Frustration began to spread. Residents recorded videos, took photos, and posted them on the platform X. Within hours, images of a massive construction site rising in what was once considered untouchable land spread at an astonishing speed. Comments flooded in. What is this project? Who is behind it? Why is it happening in silence? And more importantly, why has there been no official announcement? Amid this wave of information chaos, one name began to surface: James Hartley, an investigative journalist known for his sharp reporting on the British elite. Noticed the unusual signs. Unlike others who only shared images, Hartley began digging deeper. He reviewed local planning records. He checked construction permits. And the results surprised even him. There was no record whatsoever of any new project in the Anmer Hall area. Sensing the seriousness of the situation, Hartley decided to take a bold step. He directly contacted the office of Princess Anne to verify the information. The initial call received no clear response, But just a few hours later, a chain reaction began to unfold within the royal system. Emily Carter, a close aide to Anne, was the first to initiate an internal review. With access to asset management records, Carter examined every detail, every permit, every plan approved over the past year. And then, a troubling truth began to emerge. There had been no approval recorded for the construction taking place at Anmer Hall. This was not merely a procedural oversight. It was a complete void, a large-scale project involving dozens of vehicles, operating continuously for 3 weeks, yet leaving no legal trace within the system. That was almost impossible unless there had been deliberate interference from someone. This information was quickly passed to Princess Anne, and for someone known for her discretion, someone who rarely intervenes directly in public controversy, her reaction this time was considered unusual. Internal sources revealed that immediately after receiving the report, Anne ordered an urgent review and demanded a clear explanation for all activities in the area. Meanwhile, outside, the wave of suspicion continued to spread. Unanswered questions began to pile up. How could such a large-scale operation take place under royal oversight without anyone knowing? Who was behind it? And what was the true purpose of this project? But perhaps the biggest question at this moment was not about what was happening, but about the deeper cause behind it. What had pushed someone like Anne, who had always kept her distance from disputes, to step forward and act so decisively? To understand that, we need to go back 6 months earlier, when the first signs of a much larger plan began to quietly take shape. 6 months before the first excavators appeared in Norfolk, everything was still hidden in the shadows. There was no noise, no unusual signs, only a closed-door meeting taking place behind tightly shut doors at Clarence House, a place where even many senior staff were not allowed access. Soft yellow light fell across a long wooden table. The atmosphere was heavy, and those present understood very clearly that whatever was discussed in that room could never be allowed to leave. Camilla was the one who began. Her voice was calm but firm. She did not speak much about emotion. Instead, she went straight to the point. Power was shifting. Assets once considered stable were now facing the risk of being reassessed as the next generation prepared to take control. The greatest concern was not the present, but the near future, as William gradually strengthened his position. Underused properties such as Anmer Hall could be placed on a list for redistribution, and once that happened, the opportunity to control them would almost disappear. Tom Parker Bowles sat across from her, listening with intense focus. Unlike his mother, Tom approached the matter from a more practical perspective. To him, Anmer Hall was not just a symbolic asset, it was a wasted business opportunity, a vast estate, secluded in location, tied to the royal family yet rarely used. In the eyes of high-end investors, it was a potential gold mine, a private resort for the elite, where absolute privacy could be guaranteed, capable of generating enormous profit if developed properly. The advisors in the room began to propose options. No one suggested direct action, too risky. Instead, they spoke of complex legal structures, layers of cover that could conceal the true purpose of the project. One name was introduced: Regal Estates, a newly formed company, registered under the purpose of heritage management and preservation. On the surface, it appeared entirely legitimate, even positive, but behind that name, an entirely different plan was taking shape. Details began to fall into place. The company would apply for the necessary permits under the guise of restoration and preservation, not new construction, not commercial development, simply infrastructure upgrades to maintain historical value, a justification reasonable enough to avoid outside attention. At the same time, the funding would not be transferred directly. Instead, offshore funds would be used to ensure that the flow of money could not be easily traced. The initial figures seemed modest, Regal Estates was registered with a capital of just £1,000, an almost insignificant amount for a project of this scale. But within a few months, transactions began to appear. Large sums of money were transferred into the company account from unidentified sources. The total quickly surpassed £2.5 million, enough to transform a quiet estate into a busy construction site in a short time. Everything appeared to be carefully calculated. The timing of implementation was chosen during a period with fewer royal events. When media attention was scattered, contracts were signed through third parties. Workers were hired from multiple sources to avoid creating a clear chain of connection. Even the construction schedule was broken into smaller phases to avoid drawing too much attention in the early days. For several weeks, the plan operated smoothly. There were no leaks, no reaction from local authorities, and most importantly, no sign that Princess Anne had realized what was happening. Everything unfolded in silence, like a perfectly oiled machine operating without leaving a trace. But then, a small mistake changed everything. An internal email was sent during the coordination of the project. The sender was one of Tom's assistants. The content was originally just a routine progress confirmation, but at the end of the email, a short line appeared. "Mother approved," a phrase that seemed harmless. Yet in this context, it became a crucial piece of the puzzle, because it did not only confirm Camilla's involvement, it also showed that this was not a spontaneous action, but a plan approved at the highest level. The email had not been properly secured. It was forwarded through multiple parties, and eventually, it entered a system that no one in the project team had anticipated. A system connected to the Royal Asset Management Office. When this information began to surface, the first suspicions emerged internally, and this time, nothing could remain hidden. Financial data, legal records, and unusual transactions were all cross-checked. Inconsistencies began to appear. Gaps in the approval process became clearer than ever. Princess Anne, who had previously not been drawn into any disputes related to assets, now began receiving detailed reports. With her years of management experience, she quickly recognized that this was not a simple administrative error. This was a coordinated chain of actions, planned in advance, with a clear objective. The first steps of tracing the activity began. Every contract was re-examined, every transfer of money was tracked, and every individual involved was placed under review. This was no longer a vague suspicion. It had become a full investigation, with consequences that could spread across the entire power structure within the royal family. The plan that once seemed perfect now began to show cracks, and from those cracks, the full picture slowly emerged. But what none of the original participants could have predicted was the speed at which everything would collapse once the truth started to come to light. The operation had run smoothly in the shadows, but a single small mistake, a seemingly insignificant line in an email, changed everything. From that moment on, Princess Anne began following the trail, step by step, moving closer to a truth that many may not have wanted her to discover. As soon as the first reports were placed on her desk, Princess Anne did not hesitate for a single second. There was no delay, no indirect discussions. She understood clearly that time was the decisive factor. Every hour that passed, every ongoing construction activity, meant that traces could be erased, evidence could be blurred, and the entire truth could risk fading into silence. And so, an unprecedented internal investigation was launched at the heart of the royal family. Anne assembled a small group of individuals she trusted completely. Not high-profile names, not senior officials who might attract attention, but legal experts, financial auditors, and asset management advisors who had worked within the system for many years. Her private office quickly turned into an emergency coordination center. Documents arrived continuously, computers ran day and night, and every smallest detail was examined with precision. The first step was to review all records at the Norfolk Local Council. This was where all permits related to construction and renovation should have been stored. The experts examined every document, every application, every meeting record over the past months. But the more they checked, the more troubling the conclusion became. There was no official record of any project on the scale of what was taking place at Anmer Hall. This was almost impossible if everything had followed proper procedure. Not stopping there, the investigation team began tracing the related entities. The name Regal Estates quickly became a central focus. At first glance, the company registration appeared entirely normal. A small company, modest capital, with a stated purpose related to heritage preservation. But as they dug deeper into the ownership structure, layers of cover began to peel away. Intermediary entities appeared. Duplicate registered addresses surfaced. And then, one final name emerged in the ownership chain: Tom Parker Bowles. At that moment, the atmosphere in the room seemed to freeze. No one spoke. Yet everyone understood that the situation had gone far beyond a simple administrative violation. This was no longer about permits or procedures. This was a matter directly involving individuals with a unique position within the royal family. Anne did not waste time reacting. On that very day, she ordered a complete halt to all construction activities at Anmer Hall. An urgent notice was sent to all contractors. Machinery had to stop. Workers had to leave the site. No exceptions, no delays. The decision was enforced with a speed that surprised many. But for Anne, it was a necessary step to prevent any further attempts to conceal the truth. At the same time, she made a direct call to King Charles. No secretary, no intermediary. The conversation was kept confidential. But according to close sources, Anne presented everything she and her team had uncovered, from the absence of permits, to the unusual financial flows, to the involvement of Tom Parker Bowles. This was not just an internal issue. It had the potential to become a public crisis if not handled in time. Support from the king, though not publicly announced, was believed to have opened additional resources for the investigation. Access to financial systems, internal communication channels, and even previously restricted records was now made available. And from that point on, the most critical pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. Information technology experts were brought in to collect data from multiple sources: internal emails, messages, schedules. Everything was analyzed. A series of email chains related to the project was recovered. Within them, exchanges between assistants, advisors, and contractors revealed a remarkable level of coordination. This was not a spontaneous plan. It was organized systematically, with each step calculated in advance. Not stopping at emails, meeting records were also placed under review, although many meetings had not been officially documented, through schedules and access data. The investigation team was still able to determine the timing and participants. And then, a critical detail emerged. Within 3 months, there had been 3 secret video meetings between Tom Parker Bowles and a group of international investors. These meetings were not registered in the official royal system. There were no minutes, no notices, and most notably, not a single line in the discussions mentioned the Royal Asset Management Office. It was as if the entire project had been operated completely outside the normal control structure. At the same time, financial transactions were traced in detail. Large sums of money were transferred through multiple layers of intermediary accounts before reaching Regal Estates. Although offshore funds were designed to conceal their origins, with the coordination of auditing experts, part of the money flow could still be tracked. The transaction timelines matched the construction progress. Payments to contractors, purchases of materials, and labor costs were all made immediately after funds were received. Each piece of evidence was collected, every detail was cross-checked, and the overall picture became increasingly clear. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a structured plan. With clear financial backing and the involvement of influential individuals, what made the situation even more serious was that the entire process had taken place without any approval from official authorities. Anne followed every step of the investigation with absolute focus. She made no public statements. She revealed no signs to the outside world. But internally, the pressure continued to build. Each new piece of evidence not only reinforced suspicion, but also pushed the situation closer to an unavoidable breaking point. However, as evidence began to accumulate, another reaction emerged at the same time. Those involved did not remain still. Signs appeared that some data was being deleted. Certain accounts suddenly became inactive. Communication channels were altered. It was as if someone had realized they were being watched. That only made the investigation more urgent, because if the erasure of traces continued, what had been discovered might be only a small part of the entire story, and the rest, if successfully hidden, might never be known. The evidence was enough to raise major questions. But was it enough to hold those behind it accountable? And while the investigation continued, a silent race was unfolding in parallel. One side was trying to expose the truth. The other was doing everything possible to erase the final traces. The evidence kept growing. The pressure kept rising. But Camilla and Tom did not yield easily. They began to act. Data was erased. Connections were cut. Traces gradually disappeared. And the biggest question now was whether everything that had been uncovered could be secured before it was too late. As the evidence began to come together into a clear picture, the other side no longer remained still. Camilla and Tom understood that they had little time left. If the investigation continued to go deeper, everything would move beyond control. And so, a damage control effort was launched. Quietly but urgently. The first step was to control the narrative. A statement was prepared and circulated through unofficial channels, aiming to downplay the entire situation. According to it, what was taking place at Anmer Hall was merely a heritage survey, a project focused on assessment and preservation, not yet entering any formal construction phase. There was no resort, no commercialization plan. Everything was simply an exaggerated misunderstanding. At the same time, financial movements began to shift. The flow of money into regal estates suddenly slowed. Some investments were quickly withdrawn. Connections with offshore funds became unusually silent. It was as if the entire system was being scaled back in an effort to erase traces before it was too late. But the problem was that what had already been uncovered could no longer be concealed by a single statement. The confrontation that many had anticipated finally took place. At St. James Palace, one of the most symbolic locations and a place that had witnessed many important royal decisions. A private meeting was arranged. There was no press, no official announcement, only those directly involved. The atmosphere in the room was tense from the very first moments. Anne entered with a thick file of carefully prepared documents. There was no lengthy introduction, no indirect approach. She placed all the materials on the table and began to present them. One piece of evidence at a time. Every email, every financial transaction, every meeting record, each detail arranged in a clear and logical sequence, leaving no room for denial. Camilla listened in silence. At first, she maintained her usual composure, but as the details became more specific, as the connections grew impossible to deny, tension gradually appeared on her face. Tom, sitting beside her, said almost nothing. His expression kept shifting, from defensive to anxious, and finally to complete silence. The most critical moment came when Anne stopped, looked directly at Camilla, and waited for a response. There was no longer space for vague explanations, no room for avoidance. And then, after a long pause, Camilla finally spoke. She did not fully deny it, but she also did not openly admit everything. Instead, she chose to acknowledge part of it, explaining that the project had originally been intended to make use of an underutilized asset, that the goal was to create value without damaging the heritage. An apology was offered, not to the public, but within that closed room, a personal apology, a strategic one, and perhaps a final attempt to lessen the consequences. But Anne's response did not change. She listened, but did not yield. Her voice remained calm, yet more resolute than ever. For her, the issue was not only about intention or outcome, but about the method. The fact that a large-scale project had been carried out without approval, without transparency, and especially through complex financial structures designed to conceal it, was unacceptable. There were no exceptions. Regardless of who was behind it, the decision was made right there. The project had to be completely terminated. There would be no transition phase, no adjustments. All activities related to Regal Estates at Anmer Hall had to stop immediately. After the meeting, another critical step was taken. King Charles, after reviewing the entire file and the recommendations, signed an order to revoke all permits related to the project. This decision was final, not just a suspension, but a permanent end to any possibility of continuation in any form. What followed was almost an emergency dismantling. Within 1 week, the entire construction site at Anmer Hall was cleared. Excavators disappeared. Trucks withdrew. Temporary structures were taken down. Areas that had been dug up were filled in again. But what could not be erased were the traces beneath the surface. Unfinished foundations, incomplete structural elements. All of them stood as evidence of a project once carried out on a large scale, with costs reaching millions of pounds. This rapid transformation could not avoid attention. Local residents, who had witnessed the earlier chaos, now observed an unusual silence, as if nothing had ever happened. But the memory of those noisy weeks remained, and the questions, though never publicly answered, continued to exist in the minds of many. Inside the royal family, the consequences did not end with a cancelled project. Relationships between members became more strained than ever. This was no longer just a dispute over property. It had touched on trust, on governance, and on the sensitive boundaries of power. Subsequent meetings were said to carry a cautious atmosphere. Conversations became more guarded, and the distance between individuals seemed greater than before. For Tom, the consequences were also clear. He gradually withdrew from all activities related to projects connected to the royal sphere, no longer appearing in major plans, no longer participating in financial structures tied to shared assets. An unofficial withdrawal, but enough to show the impact of the situation. As for Anne, this was not just a successful investigation, it was a statement of principle, a clear affirmation that the values represented by the royal family could not be compromised under any circumstances. She did not seek attention. She made no public statements, but her actions spoke for themselves. Protecting heritage is not only about preserving physical structures, but also about safeguarding the principles behind them. As everything settled, Anmer Hall returned to its original calm. The fields became quiet again. Mornings once more began with sunlight and birdsong. No more machinery, no more lines of trucks. But the story that had unfolded left a mark that could not be erased. And now, as the curtain has fallen, as actions have been taken and consequences have become clear, perhaps it is time to look back at the entire situation from a broader perspective. Not only at what happened, but at what it reveals about how power, assets, and trust intertwine within one of the most closely watched families in the world. As the story gradually comes to a close, one question still lingers. Was this truly just a misunderstanding in asset management, or a calculated power move from the very beginning? On the surface, everything could be explained by a lack of transparency, by flawed decisions in managing an underused property. But when examined in detail, from the shell company structure to offshore financial flows, to unrecorded secret meetings. The picture takes on a very different tone. The key lies in intent. A project that truly aims to preserve heritage would not require such complex layers of concealment. It would not need to operate outside the official control system. And certainly, it would not leave such significant legal gaps that an entire management structure would be caught off guard. This has led many to believe that this was not simply an error, it was an attempt to gain control over assets in a time when power is gradually shifting. Throughout the story, the legacy left by Queen Elizabeth II becomes the central focus. Not only the properties and historical structures, but also the way they are protected and preserved over time. That legacy does not belong to any one individual, but to an entire system, a national symbol. And for that reason, any action that risks distorting its original purpose carries consequences far greater than what appears on the surface. The role of Princess Anne, therefore, becomes especially clear. She did not simply stop a project. She protected a principle, that what has been entrusted cannot be turned into a tool for personal gain. That power comes with responsibility, and that responsibility cannot be ignored in pursuit of financial opportunity. This story, even though it has come to an end, leaves behind a profound lesson. In any system, whether a royal institution or a modern organization, the line between management and control is always fragile, and moments like this will determine whether that line is preserved or not. After everything we have uncovered, have you commented number 1 or number 2? Do you believe this was simply a misunderstanding in asset management, or a carefully calculated scheme from the very beginning? Leave your opinion below, because it is these different perspectives that help us see the full picture more clearly. If you are drawn to royal drama stories like this, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe so you do not miss the next revelations. Each video is not just a story, but a journey into hidden corners rarely spoken about. Because, in the end, the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II endures, not only through buildings or titles, but through those who are willing to stand up and protect it, like Princess Anne, who never yields,